This week we're going to do what I probably should have done last week when we were celebrating All Saints' Day, and that is to talk about just some of my favorite saints. There are all kinds of saints. There's one for every day of the year, but these are some of the ones that might help you a little bit, ones that I think it would be good if you knew about. It's a puppet show. The puppets are like this, and they don't have faces. So you can imagine what the face looks like. You can think of some favorite relative and put that relative on there, maybe. And also, scale doesn't matter, so you're going to have to use your imagination on the props. Okay. About life way back when, what was it like when it was then? Tell us about family life. Tell us about peacetime and strife. Tell us about life way back when. Only God knows both now and then. So our first one is Saint Michael. Now he's really an archangel. So he's maybe even bigger than a saint, and he is a big one, by the way. The archangels are gigantic, ginormous, all those words. He's from the Old Testament, he's from Jewish tradition, and he wrestled the devil himself. And he won. Some people say he was wrestling a dragon, whichever story you like. He did win, and he won for all of us, to keep the forces of bad away from us. Saint, Saint Joseph. Here we have Jesus' earthly father. Imagine the responsibility of being Jesus' father. As a Jewish man, he would have had to teach young Jesus a skill. Joseph was a carpenter. And also teach him the traditions so that when he grew up, he could take his place in the society of Jewish men. When you have troubles with your dad, or someday maybe you'll be a dad and you need some extra help, think about St. Joseph and how hard his job was, and he did a wonderful job. Our next saint is Saint Mary. Here she is, Jesus's mom. She's almost always pictured with a blue robe, sometimes a lighter color, and her symbol is very often a beautiful pink, deep pink rose-colored rose. When you think about Mary, remember she was only 14, 15, 16 years old at the most, and God came to her and said, "You are going to give birth to the Messiah, the most perfect person who has ever lived on this earth." Imagine that responsibility. And Mary said, "Yes." And she pondered that in her heart. Those are the words from our Bible. When we think about 14-year-old girls, we think about craziness and magazines and makeup and dancing and all that. And I think we forget that there's another side to our 14-year-olds. Many of them are deeply wise. That pondering means she had profound depths to her. She had wisdom. Okay. When you have to deal with your mom, or when you are a mom and things seem kind of hard, remember Mary and what a job she did. What a job she had. Our next saint is Saint Peter. Oops, I forgot to introduce. Here's baby Jesus that Mary took care of. There we go. Okay, our next saint is Peter. Now, Peter lived during Jesus' lifetime. In fact, he's a recruit from Jesus. Jesus said, "Come along with me, you fisherman, and we will be a fisher of men." Peter was one of the disciples right from the start. And toward the end of Jesus' life, on the night before Jesus died, Peter denied him 3 times. 3 times he said, "No, I don't know that guy, Jesus." Because he was scared, because he was saving his own skin, because who knew what they were going to do to the friends of Jesus. And yet, After he was resurrected, Jesus went to Peter and said, "You are my rock. You are the stone on which I will build my church." So remember that when you're having trouble forgiving yourself, St. Peter found out all about forgiveness, and Jesus modeled that forgiveness for us. You can really mess up, but Jesus still loves you, and Jesus still forgives you. Maybe Jesus gives you the job of spreading his church throughout the world. Something? Our next saint, Saint Christopher. Now he's another big guy. And Saint Christopher had had a conversion experience. That means he became quite holy after leading a crazy life. And he said, "Nah, I don't want to live in a monastery, or I don't have too much to do with the church." Big guy. And I could help travelers get across the river. And that would be what I'd do. And then I'd tell them about Jesus. Mostly, I'd be helping people across the river because that was hard in those days. There weren't engineers and wonderful bridges just everywhere. So that's what he did. And one night, down at the river, it was a terrible night. It was storming, it was thundering, it was raining. You could barely see. And the river was raging. It was crazy, trying to leap out of its banks. And along comes a child and says, "Christopher, would you help me across the river?" And Christopher said, "I don't think anyone should be in that river tonight. It's too rough, it's too dangerous, it's too dark." And the child said, "I really have to go across the river, and it has to be tonight." Christopher must have taken a big breath, and he must have wondered what he was really doing, but he put that child on his back, and he carried him across the river. And when he got in the middle of the river, Christopher thought he was going under. His feet were sinking in the mud, and the water was nearly over his head. And he felt so heavy. This child was such a burden. He got to the other side, and Christopher said, "Tell me, how could it have been so heavy in the middle of the river? You're just a child." And the child said, "Yes, but I am the Christ child. And tonight you have carried the weight of the entire world on your shoulders. So when it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, remember St. Christopher. He is the patron saint of travelers." Here come our Christmas saints. Here is St. Nicholas, who was a bishop of Greece a long time ago. And the stories about Nicholas are always involved with children, saving children, helping children, performing miracles to get bread for children. Going to remember, and the symbol that we're going to go for with Saint Nicholas is there were some girls whose father was so poor he couldn't pay the girls' dowries. They couldn't get married. He was going to sell them to a place where they'd have to work for the rest of their lives at work they really didn't want to do. The story goes that St. Nicholas threw bags of silver. So pretend that's a bag of silver in a purse of gold, and saved 1, 2, 3 daughters from this horrible life. And that's why Christopher's symbol is the 3 golden balls, or bags of gold. And our other saint that comes around at Christmas time is St. Lucy. Lucy's family had some money, but Lucy was very concerned about the people that weren't allowed in her social life. Lucy spent her time worrying about people who had to live in caves because they had diseases so contagious that no one would come close to them. Well, that meant, how could they get food? Well, Lucy figured it out. Now, her parents said she couldn't do this, so she had to be sneaky. And what she did was she put a wreath on her head every night with candles in it and walked to where the caves were. And that way, her hands were free to carry loaves of bread and other kinds of food for the people who needed it. That's our St. Lucy. Her symbol is the candle. Sometimes it's eyeballs. St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. He was born in Ireland and from Ireland. He was kidnapped and taken over to the continent. And there they remained him. They made him work, work, work. Well, he got away from them and he went back to Ireland. And when he went back to Ireland, he spent the rest of his life telling everyone about the words and the work of Jesus Christ. He converted Irish to Christianity. And because it's Ireland, we think of potatoes for St. Christopher. Also, the story is that he chased all the snakes out of Ireland. So there's a snake leaving Ireland because St. Christopher is on the scene. Our next saint is one of my favorites. This is St. Hubert. Now, Hubert was a wild and crazy guy. And Hubert liked to party like none other. And he liked to drink and he liked to hang out with his friends and he loved to go hunting. He loved banging away at animals in the forest. He was out there in the forest and a stag appeared in front of him. And in between the stag's antlers, there was a cross of Jesus, and a big voice came out of everywhere and said, St. Hubert, if you keep up this life, you're going straight to hell. Well, Hubert thought, that's the first that we said. So after that, Hubert led a holy life and a good life, and his symbol remains one of my favorites, the hound dog. We have more animals on the scene because here comes St. Francis. St. Francis was a gentle soul, and when he converted, he preached to people. Pretty soon he had followers because his words were good and his words were kind. He was very deeply rooted in nature and very much felt part of the creatures of the world. St. Francis had 11 followers all of a sudden. Well, he didn't really want to go to school, but he started a monastery, and the Franciscan brothers to this day are spreading the word of Christ. His symbol is animals. And when I think of St. Christopher, or I'm sorry, when I think of St. Francis, I think of the saint with great heart and great heart for the creatures. He wrote a beautiful poem. He's the one that says, where there is hatred, let me be love. Where there is doubt, let me be faith. Where there is darkness, let me be joy. When life seems kind of dim, remember that you're part of a beautiful world filled with creatures. And remember St. Francis. Our next saint is another girl, young, like our Mary was, only this is St. Joan of Arc. Always she has her her, her chest plate on. St. Joan was a warrior. He heard voices that told her to lead her king's army into battle. And unbelievably, this little girl managed to talk the king and a whole bunch of troops into riding into battle. And because those voices knew what they were talking about, St. John's team won. And her symbols, you'll often see this chest plate, or she's almost always shown with a sword. I don't know if we can prop that up or not. Maybe we can't, but there's St. John. And our last saint, St. Teresa. It's a holy woman from India. St. Teresa spent her life worrying about the poor. In India, there are very many poor people and there are very many hungry people. St. Teresa spent her entire life worried about those people and finding ways to feed them, to keep them clothed, to make their lives better. Now, this particular St. Teresa looks like she's been eating a lot of pork chops, but really, St. Teresa was a pretty thin little person. But always you'll see her in this white robe with a blue stripe. That's generally how you can recognize her, and very often with some rice. So there are your saints. Tell me about life way back when. What was it like when it was then? Tell me about family life. Tell me about peacetime and strife. Tell us about life way back when. Only God knows both now and then. And what is our takeaway? Well, you have a whole bunch of saint stories in your head now. And let them filter down. Let them live in your heart. You know how sometimes when you don't know what to do, you might think about a family member. You might think, well, Grandpa could have done that. But I can do that. He could do that. Or my big sister, she did something like that someday. And that's your regular family. And you get strength from them because you know if they could do it, you could do it. This is your church family. These saints lived and did wonderful things, but they also left examples behind of how just thinking about them can make your life better. So when you're scared of the dark, think about St. Lucy. She must have been scared of the dark. And then you're not so alone because somebody else did that. And also just take a big flashlight too. Your church family lives in your heart. Your head worries about things, but your heart is where you'll find the strength to go on and let these wonderful saints help you. Amen.